I suppose it's dangerous to think of Dasein under the aspect of Geschichte or history taken in any ordinary sense, veering towards the empirical sense of history, which then, as Leo Strauss tells us, is the history of politics or the history of the state, and basically the history of the great people, people who have created great forms, whether it's Einstein or whether it's Alexander the Great. They've created forms which everybody else, all the rest of us, then simply go along with, including philosophy itself, including thinking. Anything, including chairs. Somebody probably originally thought up the idea of a stool or a chair, and then everybody went along with it. Somebody thought of the idea of numbers as the abstract thinking of the unit of numbers, and then the rest of us have inherited that everything that goes along with the Promethean advance, for instance. We tend to think of that in these today in terms of the genius of various sciences or various subject matter. But in any case, abstracting from that, we have the notion of the truth. And supposedly, we're able to get this compelling sense of the truth from phenomenology in our own time, going away from the methods which weren't sufficiently grounded, according to Husserl. Henrik Husserl said the rest of these guys start from the roof, from the most general, from the epistemology, so-called, but I start from the ground, from the least presuppositions, the most direct attack of confrontation with things as they are, observation, the pure piercing power of observation. But I find it worthwhile to go into the historical conditions with which some of these ideas arouse in some sense, and Heidegger encourages us in that, in looking at all the thinkers he looks at historically, such as Nietzsche, and he likes to insist on that he's doing that metaphysically rather than politically, therefore encouraging us to believe we're still in metaphysics. On this subject matter of anonymity, thinking about Heidegger, I think of the remarks of Carl Jung, who said that for the Germans, woman doesn't exist. For some reason, Jung used a French phrase, la femme n'existe pas. The woman doesn't exist. And one example of that I came across was Heidegger's dedication to his wife, where he simply says, to the mother. So it's not to his wife as an individual, whatever her specific characteristics or her individuated character, but as a mother. One sees this generally in the German world prior to World War II. The notion, also encouraged by the general social sphere, that woman is one cluster. The reason being that women could only appeal to social custom and the power of custom, and that was where their power was, to appeal to the customary and the habitual and the culture. They could not be like Socrates and go out into professions, for instance. Women were hardly introduced into the professions prior to World War II in Germany, even if there were some, quite a few exceptions. But still, the general sense of women as members of clubs that they had chosen by their own natural inclinations as going into professions which they had chosen as going into their natural inclinations, like a Madame Curie or so, somebody who has gone into something because of their own personal qualities, was much less developed in Germany at that time. I think of the concept of the persona, which is a very, in a way it's simple, but in a way it's very vexed and complicated when you think of what Bertolt Brecht does with that, and others, the idea that we can mistake ourselves for the persona. And contemporary psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas speaks of this normative disorder, I forget how he calls it exactly, but people who excessively identify with the with the normal, this can become a disorder. But also excessive, um, the idea that one is one's persona can become a disorder. I think this brings us into contact with the Dasein concept, insofar as we're thinking. Remember, Nietzsche in the Historia, the human being as uber conscious, as super conscious, as excessive conscious, as dissipated through excessive consciousness. The whole sphere of persona gives us this opportunity. We can individuate ourselves in a crude sense by joining all kinds of clubs, by identifying with all kinds of, putting ourselves in different genuses, as it were, and the whole person being part of several different organizations, clubs, church groups, whatever it may be, individuates themselves in the sense of a sort of hyperconscious and this is what I'm getting at with the non-anonymous sense. It's totally public, right? It's the total bringing of one into the public sphere, and the historiology is like this too, in this Nietzschean sense of, insofar as Heidegger imposes on Nietzsche this break with historiology on the one side, the superconscious historiology on the one side, and the Geschichte on the other, the sheltered realm of those who have not really exposed themselves to the public sphere, as it were, or have not been allowed to expose themselves to the public sphere, or have not even thought of doing so, who are pre-philosophic in the sense that Socrates is the first theoretical man, in the sense that they haven't thought to break into this sphere of differentiating themselves in one way or the other. And then there's the question of how can one break from the mere publicness into a deeper anonymity, which is individuated. I think that's one problem here that Heidegger is in some way aware of. He speaks of solitude and individuation in the title of one of his works. I also wanted to bring out that insofar as we are not just taking the method that we should treat everything Heidegger says as um, uh, the Sears Roebuck catalog, as Roosevelt saw it, as the holy text of the, capitalism, or in other words, we're not treating it as chapter and verse, but we're treating it according to everything we know. We're not just trying to rule out all possibility of discrediting Heidegger. I don't know if that it's difficult to, this is kind of an ideal way to approach any thinker. Remembering the example of the Catholics who say you can't discredit the truth of Catholicism by pointing to the empirical history of all the abuses of the Catholics, including all the terrible things done in the Crusades or whatnot, but you must only stick to the truth of the doctrine. So far as we're allowing that, we can look at what happened historically with respect to Heidegger. I think it does. We can see that Heidegger's doctrine does seem to have a historical aspect, and Jung brings that out. And Jung, who was about a generation before Heidegger, said Heidegger is banal as hell. Heidegger is banal as hell. So he saw Heidegger as repeating things that he had long already heard, knew all about. And this idea, for instance, of technology as being alien, radically alien, in a sense that I think is brought out to some extent if you just think of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. You see how the view of technology, literally technology, like industrial revolutions leading to then unimaginable fourth industrial revolution, which we're now in, but in a different guise. And you can see how people had this fear just in the gross sense, putting aside all the higher. Of course, we are aware of that. Heidegger brings a different sense, a more fundamental sense to to the technological essence, with respect to the relation to time, to the relation to being, and so on, and the sense of the everything being taken as the standing reserve, and so on. Yes, that's true, but it overlaps, and identifies with the tangible reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be of any interest to us, right? So I find congenial also. I think Guy Senstock in one of his videos spoke of going from the most tangible to the most sort of, he didn't use the same words, but something like the most tangible to the most abstract or airy. And I think I find that somewhat congenial myself, is that we should keep in mind that if we focus just on the most abstract, the most seemingly high, the philosophical, high altitude philosophy, then we kind of, that's fine, we can do that, but we want to be able to see how it works on the everyday level too. So I think this whole question of techne, we can see it in very many dimensions. That's another subject I want to go into. How is Heidegger thinking when he's trying to make us change our view? It's not only that he's trying to impel us to see a view differently, he's also trying to change the university culture and the standard idea of what science is that's come to power in the university. But again, on this subject of anonymity, I think that the super consciousness that I've been bringing out all along and other subject matters is a sign of the total destruction of anonymity, because everybody's emphasizing persona, right? Because persona has become very powerful. I think in a way it's analogous to the way money can know. I think, say, before about the year 1800 or so, one could still, and especially before the Dutch Golden Age, let's say, money could still be understood on the lines of the question of how much, how good is your life really? You didn't just ask how much money I had. You can also say, do I have the money to use it to things that actually are making my life better? But today we can hardly say that, because I think the main factor is that money is so connected to status, and status is so connected to all kinds of things that directly affect the quality of life, which wasn't always true. And in the same way, persona, public reputation, has become a bit like that. So we have this hyper lack of anonymity, and there's a deep sense of a desire for the anonymity, even though there's a distinction to be made, I think, between being sheltered in the pre-persona stage and the pre-public stage, and anonymity in the deeper sense of being, spelled with a Y, which I think would bring out a different sense, especially in the sense of the A-nomos, the non-named, as it were, and questions along those lines, which would bring us into other considerations.